The calm before the storm. Elias Carter's life had always been one of quiet discipline. The kind of discipline that kept his emotions controlled, his movements deliberate, and his mind sharp. He had learned to navigate a world that didn't always treat him fairly, but with each day, he had grown more adept at steering the course. As a federal judge, Elias had seen it all: corruption, greed, injustice, but his experience had never prepared him for what he was about to face. It was a warm, oppressive night in the city. The humidity clung to everything, coating the streets with an almost unbearable stickiness. The sounds of the city, distant car horns, murmurs from late-night walkers, and the low hum of air conditioners, seemed muffled in the thick air. The black BMW sat quietly under a street lamp, its once sleek surface now marred by a few deep dents, the hood cracked, and one headlight flickering weakly. The car had seen better days, but it was Elias's pride and joy, a symbol of his hard work and dedication to his career. He had just returned home after a long day at the courthouse, his mind still buzzing with the cases he had been handling. It wasn't a rare sight for him to be on the streets late at night, driving alone, lost in thought, as the world around him carried on. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a sense of unease settled in his gut as he parked the car outside his home. The house was a modest one, nothing extravagant, but it was his sanctuary. He had worked hard for everything he had, and this was the one place where he could finally let his guard down, even if just for a moment. But tonight, it wouldn't be the place of peace he had hoped. As Elias stepped out of his car, he heard it. The slow, deliberate footsteps of boots echoing through the street. His instincts immediately went on alert. He turned, his eyes scanning the dark shadows cast by the streetlights. Two figures emerged from the gloom, their uniforms clearly visible in the soft glow of the lamps. They weren't just regular officers, they were white, and there was an air of certainty about them, like they already knew what was going to happen next. Elias froze. He had been in enough situations to know that something was wrong, something was off, but he said nothing. His experience taught him that sometimes silence was the most powerful weapon. He stood tall, his face a mask of calm, his posture that of a man who had seen much but had never been intimidated by it. "Evening, sir," one of the officers said, his voice cold but casual. "We've had a few reports of suspicious activity around here. Can I see your ID?" Elias looked at them, his mind working quickly, but his exterior remained unaffected. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his wallet, handing over his ID without a word. The officer glanced at it, his eyes scanning over the credentials, but there was no sign of recognition. A judge's identification didn't mean much to these officers. "You're Elias Carter," the officer said slowly, almost as if testing the name. "Is that right?" "That's correct," Elias replied evenly. The officer handed the ID back to him, but something about the situation still felt wrong. Elias could see the way the officers were sizing him up, the subtle shift in their posture, as if they were looking for an excuse, waiting for the right moment to pounce. "We've had a few issues around here tonight," the officer continued, his tone now tinged with something darker. "And we need to check your vehicle." "Standard procedure." Elias's heart rate increased slightly, but he didn't let his face betray any emotion. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, being stopped, questioned, profiled, but never like this. Not outside his own home. And not like this, with the officer's eyes darting around him, not focused on his face, but on his movements, his every gesture. He was about to respond, to ask why he was being singled out when the second officer stepped forward, a slight smirk curling on his lips. "Let's make this quick, buddy," the officer said, his tone implying more than just suspicion. "We don't want any trouble." Elias felt a rising anger, but he suppressed it. It wouldn't help. He knew better than to escalate the situation. He opened the door to his car and stepped back, allowing the officers to take a look. As they moved closer, the sound of their boots on the pavement seemed to fill the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had dominated the street only moments before. The officers began their search, rifling through the car with deliberate carelessness. They were aggressive, as if trying to provoke a response. But Elias stood still, watching, waiting. The longer they took, the more his unease grew. He had the sinking feeling that they weren't looking for anything in the car, they were looking for an excuse to do something worse. Suddenly, without warning, the first officer slapped his hand down hard on the hood of the BMW, making a loud bang that echoed in the night air. "Hey, you got something to hide in here," he barked, his voice rough and filled with anger. Elias's body stiffened, but he remained silent. His mind raced. The situation was escalating far beyond a routine stop, and he knew it wouldn't be long before things took a much darker turn. But there was nothing he could do. He couldn't act on instinct, not yet. He had to wait for the right moment. Then, as if by some twisted fate, it happened. One of the officers, frustrated by the lack of anything in the car to arrest Elias for, slammed his fist against the side door in frustration. The impact was hard enough to send a jolt through the car, causing a dent to form where his hand had struck. Elias's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a stop anymore. This was something much worse. Before he could react, the first officer turned to him, his face contorted with rage. "Step away from the vehicle," the officer shouted, grabbing Elias by the arm and shoving him toward the sidewalk. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting." Elias's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He knew what was coming next. The second officer moved swiftly, placing handcuffs around his wrists with practiced efficiency. It all happened so quickly, too quickly for Elias to even process the full extent of what was happening. But he knew one thing for sure, he was being treated like a criminal, as if he was some common thug off the street. Just as the handcuffs clicked into place, Elias opened his mouth, his voice calm but firm. He only needed to say 5 words. "I'm a federal judge," he said, his tone devoid of any fear, any panic. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. The officers froze. The smug, confident looks on their faces shifted in an instant. Panic flooded their eyes, and for the first time since the encounter began, they looked unsure. Everything changed in that moment. The weight of the words Elias had just spoken hung heavy between them, and it was clear to both officers that they had made a monumental mistake, the weight of justice. The streets, once alive with the noise of distant traffic and the occasional footstep, now felt almost eerily silent. A heavy tension filled the air, thick with the realization that the situation had spiraled out of control, and that the consequences would reach far beyond this moment. The two officers stood motionless in front of Elias, unable to process the enormity of their mistake. The sound of distant sirens began to grow closer, but the night remained still as a storm slowly gathered on the horizon, both in the weather and in the hearts of the men involved. Elias stood with his back straight, his hands still handcuffed in front of him. Despite the tightness around his wrists, he felt no discomfort, no urge to break free. The handcuffs were symbolic in that moment, mere metal and wire compared to the weight of what was truly binding them all together, the law, the truth, and the unspoken understanding of power. Elias knew this game, and the way it was played. He had seen how easily the truth could be bent, manipulated, twisted into something unrecognizable. And he had seen the small, quiet victories, those moments when justice had been served, even when it seemed impossible. But tonight wasn't about him. Not yet. It was about the officers, their choices, and how they would face the consequences of their actions. The second officer, whose earlier bravado had quickly evaporated, looked over at his partner. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched in discomfort. "What now?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't asking for answers from Elias but to his partner, the officer who had taken the lead. There was no denying it now. They had made a grave mistake. The truth was laid bare in front of them, and it was as crushing as the weight of the night pressing down on them. The first officer, Officer O'Connor, looked as though the world had crumbled beneath his feet. His eyes darted nervously around the empty street, as if searching for something, anything, to hold on to. His fingers shook as he clutched his radio, waiting for further orders. But none came immediately. Instead, there was only the stillness, broken only by the sound of Elias's calm breathing. A few moments passed before the radio crackled again, breaking the tension like thunder before the rain. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, and stern. "Officer O'Connor," the dispatcher said. "You are to release Judge Carter immediately. Stand down and await further instructions. This will be handled at the highest level." O'Connor's face drained of color, and his hand dropped to his side, the radio hanging limply in his fingers. He didn't look at Elias. He couldn't. Not after everything that had just unfolded. His actions had been reckless, and now the entire weight of his profession was hanging over him. And Elias? He stood there, unbroken, his face as calm and composed as ever. I'm sorry," O'Connor stammered, but there was no conviction in his voice. No true apology. It was as if the words themselves were foreign to him, swallowed by the shame that now clouded his judgment. The second officer, standing behind him, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Neither of them seemed to know how to proceed. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. The reality of what had just occurred was undeniable. Elias took a deep breath, his voice low and measured. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said again, this time more firmly. "What you need to do is reflect on what happened here tonight. Reflect on the actions you chose to take, and then understand the consequences. This isn't just about me. This is about every person you've stopped, every citizen you've questioned, every person you've mistreated because of a badge that, for some, has come to represent power rather than responsibility." The words were quiet but had a weight to them that hung in the air, palpable in their clarity. The officers stood still, the enormity of their actions washing over them. Officer O'Connor opened his mouth to say something, but the words failed him. Instead, he nodded stiffly, as though he knew there was nothing he could say to undo the wrong he had just committed. The sirens in the distance grew louder, and soon, the sound of a squad car pulling up was heard. Two more officers emerged from the car, both of them were more senior, their expressions grim as they approached the scene. They weren't here to check the situation or to lend a helping hand. They were here to assess, to deal with the fallout of a catastrophic mistake. One of them, a tall officer with a thick mustache and a weathered face, took one look at Elias and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. His eyes widened slightly, and he moved quickly toward the first officer, speaking in low, controlled tones. "What happened here, O'Connor?" the officer asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. There was no room for hesitation in his words. His eyes flicked between the two officers, then to Elias. He could see immediately what had gone wrong, the handcuffs, the tense atmosphere, the unmistakable calm of the man in front of them. But most of all, he saw the fear in the officer's eyes. Fear of being caught, fear of the consequences, fear of the judgment that would surely come. "Sir," Officer O'Connor began, his voice weak, we mistook Judge Carter for someone else. Before he could finish, the senior officer raised a hand to stop him. "Save it," he said, his tone dismissive. "We don't need your excuses. You've messed up, and you'll deal with the fallout from that. But right now, you're going to release the man and give him the respect he deserves." Elias stood quietly, his back straight as he watched the exchange. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel like a victor. What he felt, what weighed heavily on him, was the knowledge that this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just about his experience tonight. It was about the systemic issues that had led to this encounter in the first place, the assumptions made based on his appearance, the way he had been treated simply because of the color of his skin. The officers didn't know who he was at first, they only saw a black man in a nice car late at night, someone they assumed was guilty before they knew anything about him. And that was the part that burned the most. The senior officer turned toward Elias, his face softening as he took a step closer. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice now laced with professionalism and a hint of regret. "We are deeply sorry for what happened here tonight. It should never have gotten this far. You have my word that this will be handled appropriately, and the officers involved will be held accountable." Elias nodded, but there was no expression of forgiveness in his eyes. He had learned long ago that apologies were just words unless they were backed up by action. "I'm sure you'll do what's necessary," he replied, his tone even. "But I want you to understand that this isn't just a mistake. It's a pattern. A pattern of behavior that too many people face every day." The senior officer's face hardened, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't speak again, but he knew that Elias's words weren't just a reprimand, they were a call to action. "Release him," the senior officer ordered. "And make sure this never happens again." The handcuffs were removed slowly, the cold metal falling away from Elias's wrists. But as they did, the weight of the situation wasn't gone. The officers, O'Connor, the second officer, and the senior one, knew that they had crossed a line, one that they couldn't erase with a simple apology or a promise to do better. Elias stepped away from them, his gaze steady and unwavering. As he turned to walk toward his home, he knew that the battle was far from over. It was just beginning. The fight for justice, for accountability, and for the truth would always remain. But tonight, Elias had sent a clear message: he would not be silenced, not by fear, not by intimidation, and certainly not by the actions of those who thought they were above the law. The officers stood in silence, the consequences of their actions hanging over them like a storm ready to break the reckoning. The night had become unbearably still again, but in the silence, there was a sense of anticipation, an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same after this. Elias's footsteps were deliberate as he walked toward his house, the heavy weight of his thoughts blending with the rhythmic sound of his shoes against the cracked pavement. He had known moments like this, moments that weighed on him with a heaviness that wasn't just physical but emotional. This wasn't just about the police stop. It was about something deeper, a systemic injustice that played out daily for so many others who never had the opportunity to speak out, to stand their ground, or to demand accountability. Tonight, Elias had spoken those words, 5 words, that shattered the comfortable world the officers had built for themselves. As he reached his front door, Elias paused, his hand resting on the knob. He had lived in this house for over 10 years, a quiet man who believed in the power of action over words. But tonight, the words felt more necessary than ever. It wasn't just about him now. It was about making sure that this story, this moment, didn't get lost in the sea of other headlines, other stories, other lives crushed by an unjust system. He was a judge, yes, but that title carried weight far beyond the courtroom. It was a responsibility to speak the truth, to challenge the status quo, to ensure that when people fell through the cracks, someone would be there to catch them. As Elias entered his home, the door closing behind him with a soft click, he walked through the familiar hallway to his study. The walls, lined with books, cases, legal precedents, history, felt almost suffocating in the quiet. He didn't turn on the lights. The glow from the streetlights outside filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room, stretching out like the fingers of a ghost. But Elias didn't mind. He welcomed the shadows tonight. He had always kept a low profile, preferring to let his work speak for itself. The judiciary system was flawed, yes, but Elias believed in its potential. He believed in the power of the law to make things right, to correct injustices, and to set wrongs to right. But even a man like him, someone who had spent decades in navigating the maze of laws, policies, and human behavior, knew that the system was not as objective as it claimed to be. He had seen it firsthand, people of color, like him, subjected to unjust stops, unfair treatment, and even worse. For many, the system didn't work for them. It worked against them. He sighed deeply and moved to his desk, where a stack of papers lay untouched. His pen rested beside them, forgotten in the chaos of the evening's events. But tonight, he couldn't focus on anything else but what had happened. He wasn't angry, not yet, at least. The anger would come later, and when it did, it would be more than just an emotion. It would fuel a fire that couldn't be extinguished until justice was served. A knock on the door startled him out of his reverie. He wasn't expecting anyone. His heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. It could be the officers, returning to offer some form of apology or clarification, though he knew that no words could undo what had already been done. Or it could be someone else, someone who had heard about the incident, who felt the need to speak with him. He wasn't sure. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. Elias rose from his chair and moved toward the door. He opened it slowly, not knowing what to expect. Standing in front of him was a woman he didn't recognize, tall, with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and a serious expression on her face. Her attire was businesslike, though it didn't match the late hour. Her gaze met his with a steely resolve, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm Detective Harper," the woman said, her voice firm but not unfriendly. "I need to speak with you about what happened tonight. May I come in?" Elias studied her for a moment, sizing her up. He had been a judge for long enough to know when someone came with an agenda, but there was something about the way she carried herself that didn't scream authority or power. There was something more personal about this encounter. He nodded, stepping aside to allow her in. "Please," he said, his voice steady but cautious. Harper entered and took a seat at the small chair by the window, her posture rigid, as if ready to stand at a moment's notice. She looked at Elias with the same focused intensity, but now there was something else in her eyes, respect, perhaps, or the understanding that he had been more than just a victim in this case. He was a man of influence, a man whose words could carry weight, and that was something she was acutely aware of. "First, let me say that I'm sorry for what happened tonight," she said. "I've been briefed on the situation, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't there when it happened, but I've seen the video footage, and I can tell you that what those officers did was wrong. And they'll have to answer for it." Elias didn't react, but his mind churned. He had expected apologies, but this was different. She wasn't offering empty words, she was offering a sense of accountability. There was something real in her tone, something that suggested she understood the weight of what had occurred. It wasn't just the officer's fault. It was the fault of a system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. And Harper, for whatever reason, was choosing to do something about it. "I appreciate your honesty," Elias replied, his voice measured. "But what I need is action. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been stopped like this. Every person who has been profiled, harassed, or mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. The system is broken, Detective Harper. And tonight, those officers were part of it." Harper's gaze softened for a moment, her lips tightening as she considered his words. "I know," she said quietly. "But there are people in this department who want to change things, Judge Carter. And I'm one of them. I can't promise you everything will be fixed overnight, but I'm willing to fight for it. I need people like you, people with the courage to speak up and hold us accountable." Elias's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. She wasn't just doing her job. She wasn't just here because it was protocol. She was here because she believed in something greater than the badge she wore. She believed in justice. But Elias knew that the road ahead would be long. He knew that the system wasn't something that could be corrected with a few apologies or by holding a couple of officers accountable. This was a battle that had been fought for centuries, a fight that didn't have an easy solution, nor a quick end. It was a fight that demanded change at every level, from the streets to the courts, from the police force to the halls of government. "I'll help you," Elias said quietly. "But I need you to understand that this is more than just a case. This is about dismantling a culture of injustice that has been built for generations. It's going to take more than just good intentions." Harper nodded, a look of determination on her face. "I know. But we have to start somewhere." As she stood to leave, Elias felt something stir inside him. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. Maybe, just maybe, change was possible. And he would be there to ensure that it didn't just fade away. As she stepped toward the door, Elias's voice stopped her. "Detective," he said, and she turned to face him. "If you're serious about this, about making a real difference, then I need you to promise me one thing." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Don't let this become another story of what could have been. Make sure this changes something." Harper's gaze was steady as she nodded. "I promise you, Judge Carter, it will." The ripple effect. The next few days unfolded in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and reports. Elias had never been one to shy away from hard work, but this was different. The pressure of what had happened was heavy, weighing him down with every step he took. It wasn't just about what he had endured that night, it was about the ramifications of what it represented. The encounter wasn't an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of the larger systemic issues that had plagued not only the police force but the entire justice system for generations. And now, Elias found himself standing at the precipice, holding in his hands the weight of a truth that he knew couldn't be ignored any longer. The media had quickly caught wind of the incident, and what had initially been a local story ballooned into something much larger. News outlets across the country began to pick up the story, discussing the tension between law enforcement and communities of color, the racial profiling that had been so deeply entrenched in policing, and the implications of a federal judge being mistreated by the very system he had sworn to uphold. People from all walks of life began to take notice, some in support, others in opposition. But Elias didn't care about the headlines. He had been through enough to know that the attention would eventually fade. What mattered to him was ensuring that this wasn't just another fleeting moment, a scandal that would be brushed under the rug when the public's attention shifted to the next headline. This was bigger than him. It was bigger than the officers involved. It was about a country that needed to reckon with its past and its present. Detective Harper had kept her promise. Over the following days, she worked tirelessly to gather evidence and begin the internal investigation. Elias could sense the weight of the task on her shoulders. He had seen enough in his career to recognize when someone was truly committed to doing the right thing, and she was. She wasn't interested in sweeping the incident under the rug. She was determined to make sure the officers involved faced the consequences of their actions. But that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. Elias had been approached by several of his colleagues, judges, lawyers, even some local politicians, offering their support. Some of them were genuinely interested in ensuring justice was served, while others simply saw an opportunity to align themselves with a high-profile case. Elias had seen it all before. The politics of justice were often murky, and many people were more concerned with their own advancement than with actually creating change. But he knew that in order to push through the resistance, in order to force the system to look itself in the mirror, he would need allies. He just had to be careful about who those allies were. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, discussing the legal ramifications of what had happened. The case wasn't just about police misconduct, it had the potential to shift the discourse around race and justice in the country. If he played his cards right, this could become a turning point in how people viewed the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. But Elias was under no illusions. He knew that those in power would do everything they could to bury this story, to downplay its significance. They would use every tool at their disposal to twist the narrative, to spin it in their favor. One morning, as Elias sipped his coffee in the study, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, but when he answered it, he found himself face to face with an old acquaintance, Mayor Jonathan Ames. The mayor had always been a political figure who danced around issues of race, often taking the middle ground and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. But today, his face was drawn, his expression serious. "Elias," the mayor said, shaking his head as he stepped inside. "I've heard what happened. This is bad, really bad." Elias didn't offer any pleasantries. "I'm sure you've heard worse." Ames nodded grimly, looking around the room as though searching for something to hold on to. "This isn't just about you. It's about the city. The department. Everything. The kind of damage this could do, it could take years to undo. You've made waves, Elias. Big ones." Elias crossed his arms, watching the mayor with a mixture of caution and disbelief. "Is that why you're here, Ames? To tell me how bad it is? Or is there something you're actually planning to do?" The mayor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of Elias's question. "Look, I'm not here to make excuses. What happened was wrong. We both know that. But I'm not going to pretend that this isn't going to cause major political fallout. The department's under a microscope. The public is demanding answers. We're talking about protests, citywide unrest. This could get ugly, Elias. Real ugly." Elias didn't flinch. He had seen the ugliness of politics before. He had seen how things were often swept under the rug when the right people decided it was inconvenient to confront the truth. "The city's been ugly for a long time, Ames," Elias replied evenly. "It's just that tonight, it decided to show its face. You can't sweep this under the rug anymore." The mayor stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, he sighed. "What do you want me to do, Elias? Do you want me to come out in front of the press and make a statement? Do you want me to throw the department under the bus? Because if I do that, there's no going back. People won't forget." Elias's voice remained steady, but his words cut to the heart of the matter. "I don't want you to do anything, Ames. I want you to stop playing both sides. I want you to stop pretending that these problems don't exist. Stand up for what's right, not just what's politically expedient." The mayor stood silent for a moment, his face hardening as he considered the weight of Elias's words. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear that he didn't fully agree. "I'll see what I can do," he said, his voice resigned. After Ames left, Elias stood by the window, staring out at the street. The city was alive with the usual hum, the usual noise. But Elias felt disconnected from it all. He felt like a spectator in a game he hadn't chosen to play, yet one in which he had no choice but to participate. Later that evening, Detective Harper called with an update. The investigation was proceeding as expected, slowly but steadily. She had begun interviewing witnesses, gathering statements, and collecting evidence. The officers involved were being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. But the real work, Harper knew, was yet to come. She had to prove that this wasn't just an isolated mistake, that it was part of a larger pattern of behavior within the department. She had to find the cracks in the system and expose them for all to see. "We're not backing down, Elias," Harper said, her voice firm but determined. "I know this is bigger than just this one case. But we're going to make sure it counts. I need your help, your support, through this. It's going to get messy, but we can't let them bury this." Elias could hear the resolve in her voice. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. She wasn't afraid to face the backlash that would surely come. And in that moment, Elias knew that he had made the right choice. This wasn't just about a momentary victory, it was about something far more important. It was about forcing a reckoning. "I'm with you," Elias replied quietly, though he knew the battle was far from over. "Let's make sure it counts." And with that, the real fight began. The unraveling. As the days stretched into weeks, the storm Elias had sensed growing on the horizon finally began to break. The investigation into the incident that had begun with the wrong assumption about Elias's identity snowballed into a much larger conversation. What had once been a singular case of police misconduct had now become a flashpoint, igniting long-simmering tensions within the community, among law enforcement, and at every level of government. The city was at the brink of something bigger, a reckoning that had been a long time coming. Elias had spent his days in constant motion. He met with reporters, spoke with legal experts, and consulted with his allies in the judiciary. He was methodical, deliberate, and laser-focused on the task at hand. But there were moments, too, when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. His name was everywhere. It appeared on every news outlet, from the local stations to national networks. The hashtag Justice for Judge Carter trended on social media, with people across the country sharing their own stories of police abuse and racial profiling. There were protests in the streets, some peaceful, others more chaotic. People demanded change, demanded accountability, and many of them used Elias's story as a rallying cry. The media painted him as a hero, a man who had fought back against an unjust system, someone who had stood firm and unapologetic in the face of adversity. But Elias knew better than to embrace the label of hero. He was not fighting for personal glory, he was fighting for the future, for those who couldn't speak out, for those who had been silenced by the weight of systemic oppression. The cameras, the crowds, the headlines, they were just distractions. His focus remained on the truth. In private moments, when he was alone in his study, Elias found himself reflecting on the road that had led him here. He had chosen this path, the path of the law, because he believed in justice, in fairness, and in the power of the system to correct itself. But now, after all these years, he could see that the system was broken. The law wasn't broken, the way it was applied was. He had seen the disparity between how people of color were treated in the justice system versus how white individuals were treated. It wasn't just about the police force, it was about a culture that had been cultivated for generations, one in which the marginalized were treated as less than, their voices ignored. Elias knew that things had to change. But changing a system that had been entrenched for so long would be no small task. There would be resistance. There would be backlash. People would try to silence him, to discredit him, to paint him as a troublemaker. But Elias was prepared for that. He had been through enough in his life to know that nothing worth fighting for came without a cost. Meanwhile, Detective Harper's investigation into the officers involved in the incident continued, but it wasn't easy. The police department was full of tension. There were whispers in the hallways, looks exchanged behind closed doors, and a growing sense of unease as the investigation gained momentum. Some officers were supportive of the investigation, but many were not. The department was divided, and as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the situation was far from black and white. There were good officers within the ranks who were tired of the corruption, tired of the systemic racism that had been allowed to persist. But there were also those who felt threatened by the investigation, those who were willing to protect their own at any cost. Harper had to walk a fine line, balancing her commitment to the truth with the reality of the department's deep-seated issues. She knew that exposing the rot at the core of the system would have consequences, not just for the officers involved, but for the department as a whole. But she also knew that staying silent, staying complicit, would be far worse. One evening, after a long day of interviews and evidence gathering, Harper called Elias with an update. She sounded more somber than usual. "We've found something," she said, her voice tight. "Something that's going to change everything." Elias felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but with a flicker of concern. "There's a pattern," Harper continued. It's not just these two officers. We've discovered evidence of widespread misconduct within the department, racial profiling, abuse of power, false arrests, and more. And it's been going on for years. I'm talking about a culture of corruption that's been allowed to fester unchecked. These two officers were just a part of it. But there's more, Elias. Much more. Elias leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a systemic issue, one that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The rot ran far beyond the officers who had been directly involved in his case. It was embedded in the fabric of the entire department, and it was going to take more than just a few policy changes to fix it. Are you sure? Elias asked quietly, his mind racing. I've seen the evidence, Elias. I've spoken to witnesses. We're not just talking about a few isolated incidents. This is a pattern of behavior that goes back years. These officers, O'Connor, the one who arrested you, and others, were just doing what they thought was normal. What they'd been trained to do. But there's a larger issue here, one that goes all the way to the top. Elias's mind spun as he processed the gravity of what Harper was saying. This wasn't just about holding a few officers accountable anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system of abuse. This was about confronting a culture that had perpetuated racism and inequality for far too long. He felt a fire spark inside him, a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. We need to go public with this, Elias said firmly. The people need to know the truth. The city needs to know what's been happening right under their noses. Harper hesitated. It's going to be messy, Elias. There are people in power, people who have a vested interest in keeping this quiet. There will be resistance, and not just from the department. From the politicians, from the media. You're talking about a full-scale exposure of the corruption within the force. I know what I'm saying, Elias replied, his voice resolute. But this is bigger than political fallout. This is about justice. And it's time for the truth to come out. Harper was silent for a moment, but Elias could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke, her tone firm. All right. We'll do it. But we're in this together, Elias. We're going to need to be prepared for the backlash. It's going to come, and it's going to come hard. Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. I've been prepared for this my whole life. Let's make sure the truth isn't buried. The next few days were a whirlwind. Harper, Elias, and their team worked around the clock to compile the evidence they had gathered. They worked with trusted journalists, legal experts, and activists to ensure that the story would be told in full. They didn't just want to expose the officers involved, they wanted to expose the entire corrupt system that had allowed them to operate unchecked. And with every passing hour, it became clearer that this was not going to be a quick or easy fight. It would be the fight of their lives. When the story finally broke, it did so with the force of a hurricane. The public's reaction was swift and overwhelming. The police department was rocked to its core. Protests erupted in the streets, some peaceful, others more confrontational. The city was alive with anger, with calls for reform, and with a sense of unity that had been absent for far too long. The corruption that had been allowed to fester for years was now out in the open, and the world was watching. Elias stood at the center of it all, knowing that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The truth had been exposed, and now the real work could begin. But as the protests grew louder and the voices of the people became more insistent, Elias knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The real work, true justice, would take years. It would take more than just public outcry. It would take a long, hard look at the system, at the policies, and at the people in power who had allowed the rot to spread for so long. And Elias Carter, a man who had spent his life dedicated to the law, would be there every step of the way. This was his fight now. And he wasn't backing down. The long road ahead. The weeks that followed the explosive revelations were a blur of relentless activity and tension. The city was on fire, metaphorically, and in some places, literally. The protests continued to swell in numbers, reaching their peak after the news spread that the investigation had uncovered not only systemic abuse within the police force but also connections to corrupt political figures who had long turned a blind eye to the department's transgressions. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Not after everything they had exposed. The story had reached far beyond the city's borders. National news outlets were picking up the story in droves, and even international media had begun to take note. The images of crowds chanting for justice, the raw energy of people who were tired of waiting for change, filled the airwaves. The pressure on both the police department and the mayor's office was mounting, and with it, the call for reform grew louder by the day. The city, once silent about its broken justice system, now had a voice that could no longer be ignored. But Elias knew that this was just the beginning. The road to true change was long, and every victory would be hard-fought. In private, the mayor had reached out to Elias, his tone more cautious than it had been in the past. Mayor Ames had spoken about a desire for change, but Elias wasn't fooled. Politics had its own game to play, and while Ames could claim to be on the right side of history, Elias knew the mayor's true loyalty lay in maintaining his position of power. In his study, Elias sifted through a stack of reports that had accumulated over the past few days, statements from officers, testimonies from citizens, and summaries of the ongoing investigation. He had seen firsthand how the wheels of justice moved slowly, how the system often protected itself at the expense of those it was meant to serve. And even now, with the truth laid bare, he knew that many would fight tooth and nail to prevent real change from taking root. Detective Harper had become a critical ally, not just in the investigation, but in the larger battle for accountability. She had risked everything, her career, her reputation, her safety, in order to pursue the truth. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. And with each new revelation, the system seemed to unravel further. But Harper was weary. She was exhausted by the constant pushback from within the department, the subtle threats, and the whispered warnings that this would end badly for her if she didn't back down. But she never wavered. Neither did Elias. The night was Elias's only refuge, his chance to find solitude in a world that seemed to be turning faster and faster by the day. He stood in front of his window, looking out over the city. The lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of both the progress and the struggle. Somewhere, in a crowd, was a mother who had lost her son to the same injustices that had ignited this fire. Somewhere, a father was holding his child and wondering what kind of world they would inherit. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night, a community was waiting for change, waiting for someone to prove that justice wasn't just a word on a page, but something real, something tangible that they could hold on to. Elias's phone buzzed, breaking his moment of reflection. It was Harper. "We've got a problem," her voice crackled through the line. "We've discovered something new. Something bigger than we thought." Elias's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Harper's voice was tight, almost strained. "We've traced a significant portion of the corruption back to the top. It's not just the police force, Elias. It's political. It's embedded in the system in ways we didn't even suspect. There's money flowing under the table, deals made in the shadows, and the people involved are too powerful to just let this slide." Elias's hand clenched around the phone. He had suspected as much. There were always whispers of corruption in high places, of powerful individuals who operated behind closed doors, untouchable by the law. But now, it seemed those whispers were louder, more real. The fight wasn't just against a broken system, it was against an entrenched power structure that would stop at nothing to maintain its grip. "How deep does it go?" Elias asked, his voice low. It goes deep, Harper replied. And it's not just about money. It's about control. The control of the city. The control of its people. And they've been using the police force to keep that control in check, to silence anyone who threatens their position. Elias felt a cold surge of anger rise within him. He had seen corruption before, but this was something different. This wasn't just a few bad actors, this was a coordinated effort to maintain a power imbalance at any cost. We can't back down now, Harper, Elias said, his voice hardening. We have to expose everything. Every last piece of this. I know, she replied, her tone fierce. But Elias, you need to understand. Going public with this, taking down these people, could mean the end of the city as we know it. The backlash will be massive. And there are people who will fight back with everything they have. I don't care, Elias said, his resolve solidifying. We've come this far. We're not stopping. If this city is ever going to change, if this system is ever going to change, then we have to tear it down to the ground. It's the only way. Harper was quiet for a moment, her breath audible on the line. You're right. Let's do it. Let's bring it all out into the open. The decision had been made. But Elias knew the cost. The people who held power would not give it up easily. And they would fight back with everything they had, public smear campaigns, legal battles, perhaps even more dangerous methods. But that didn't matter to him anymore. The truth had to come out. As Elias sat at his desk, preparing for the next steps, he couldn't help but think back to his own life, how he had come to this point. He had been a young man once, just like everyone else, full of hope and optimism, believing that the system could be changed from within. But as the years passed, that optimism had been tempered by reality. The system was rigged, and the people who had the power to change it were often the ones who benefited the most from its flaws. But Elias wasn't the same man he had been when he first started his career. He had seen too much, learned too much, and now, he was ready to do what was necessary to ensure that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same battles. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered, who had been silenced, who had been made to feel powerless. The next day, the world would know the full extent of what had been uncovered. The press conference was scheduled. The truth would finally be revealed, and there would be no turning back. But Elias wasn't afraid. He was ready. Ready to face the storm that was coming, ready to take on those who thought they could hide in the shadows. And so, the long road to justice began in earnest. It would be difficult. It would be painful. It would take everything Elias had, and more. But he was ready. For the first time in years, he felt the fire of conviction burning inside him, and he knew one thing for sure, he would not back down. Not now. Not ever.